Perfect. Can you guys hear me? Awesome. So yes, so some of you may have seen the first edition of the book, and I'm going to go through this evening for those who haven't seen LBJs mentioned before how we approach LBJs as a three-step method of identification. But in all honesty, the whole three-step rule can actually be applied to any group of birds that you want to identify. But I'll read how the book works and how the methodology of the three-step identification process works. So the first question that would normally be asked is, are LBJs really as difficult as people make them out to be? And the answer to that is, if you approach LBJ identification in a complex, unstructured manner, yes, it's a very daunting process. And the families look similar, the individual species look similar. And a bigger problem that you have is not all species fit nicely into their family groups. Some species vary in appearance, where races or subspecies look vastly different from one area to the other. And when you try and put all that information on a single plate, it effectively becomes too much information. And in some cases, generalizations are made to try and simplify this identification process, which leads to more problems, which I'll get to in a second. So the key thing to note is that we have specifically called LBJs Made Simple an identification guide versus a field guide. And there's fundamental differences between the two types of works, so to speak. So in a field guide, you'll notice any of the major bird books, they don't often break the species down into the individual races or subspecies. And as a result, for example, the Roberts Geographical Variations book was released to cover those gaps. In a proper ID guide, the races are dealt with individually and differently as are needed. And also in a field guide, when you're flipping through pages, the context in which the pointers are meant aren't always very clear. And I'll give you some examples of where that can often lead to confusion. Whereas with the ID guide, it's very much context driven. You also have limited space if you want to give species a detailed treatment. So a full Southern African Birds Made Simple would probably be 1,200 to 1,500 pages to deal with all the variations properly. Whereas in an ID guide, you get more space for individual species and to treat the identification properly, so to speak. And the key thing that we've done with LBJs Made Simple is to use a modeling process where effectively we've made sure there's no way that looking at the pointers, if you approach the identification properly, that you can falsely identify another bird by getting a false match, so to speak. And the other problem with field guides is it's often quite subjective, and I'll get to the problem of subjectivity in a minute. And what we've strived to do, and there are unfortunately a handful of cases where you can't avoid it, but we've always tried to avoid subjective terms, longer, shorter, whatever the case may be, because without experience of both species, those subjective terms don't really mean anything. And first, looking at the problem of subjectivity, because most field guides are riddled with subjective terminology. The problem with this, as I said, is you need previous experience to be able to use it. It's often too difficult because you don't have the field experience, and that ultimately creates an unrealistic expectation on you when you're reading the book, that somehow you should be able to tell these differences. The best example I could give you is if I told you I've got two friends and John is taller than Paul. You've never met any of them, and one of them walks in the room and I ask you, is that John or Paul? Well, taller means nothing unless you've seen both of them. And here's a brilliant video that shows just the example of the problem with subjectivity.
You know, they do say that the Infanta's eyes are more beautiful than the famous stone of Galveston.
What?
The famous stone of Galveston, my lord.
And what's that exactly?
Well, it's a famous blue stone. And it comes from Galveston.
I see. And what about it?
Well, my lord, the Infanta's eyes are bluer than it for a start.
I see. And have you ever seen this stone?
No, not as such, my lord, but I know a couple of people who have, and they say it's very, very blue indeed.
And have these people seen the Infanta's eyes?
No, I shouldn't think so, my lord.
And neither have you, presumably.
No, my lord.
So what you're telling me, Percy, is that something you have never seen is slightly less blue than something else you have never seen.
Yes, my lord.
Percy.
And that's the problem with subjectivity. To say, for example, one lark's back is slightly more richer brown than another lark, neither of which you've seen, really is unfortunately of very little use to you unless you already somewhat of an LBJ expert. And the bigger problem is when pointers are mentioned out of context. And a while ago in one of the previous editions of one of the major field guides, there were some pointers on the clapper larks, and one of them said brown back and one of them said grey back. Now, unless you as the reader know that that means separating the two clapper larks from each other, namely the eastern and or Cape clapper lark from the Orgullis clapper, which has a significantly greyer back, I was showing larks to another birder, and I pointed out the brown back, and they said, well, what on earth does that mean? Because all the larks have brown backs. So unless you clearly state that those pointers are meant in the context of these two birds, the pointers can start to become a little bit confusingly meaningless out of context. And the other problem is when you start to generalize around subspecies. If you take lazy cisticola, it's well known as a plain-backed cisticola. Most of the lazy cisticolas you'll see have very little back markings at all. However, there is a race, and if you look at the one on the right, that's a lazy cisticola, but that back has a reasonable amount of markings on, and an argument could be raised that that's not a plain back. So when you try and put the entire set of subspecies into one box, they don't always fit. And when you come across the cisticola on the right, if your book tells you that a lazy cisticola has a plain back, you're going to go immediately, well, that's not a lazy cisticola then, and you'll look somewhere else and make an incorrect identification. And one of the biggest and most amusing generalizations that I've ever seen is when it's stated that a Levallois cisticola is a wetland cisticola. Because in actual fact, there are many, many cases, and particularly in Gauteng, and I know it happens down in the Western Cape as well. If you go up into the alpine grasslands of Suikerbosrand, there are tons of Levallois cisticolas living and breeding very far from any water. And I actually had an interesting argument with a birder whose book said Levallois was a wetland cisticola, and because we were far from wetland, it couldn't be that, and he incorrectly identified it as a Cape grass bird because his book said it was a wetland cisticola. So with all these problems with the way LBJ identification can and has been approached, how do you go about identifying them? And obviously, from our point of view, a structured approach to identifying them is how we handle it in LBJs Made Simple. And as I mentioned, we try and use as few subjective features as possible, so you don't have to know whether the bill is longer or shorter than another species. And we only use features that are easy to use. So we won't say that birds where there's an average of 2 millimeter difference in bill length, you need to be able to tell those very fine details in bill structure to make an identification, because the vast majority of birders are unable to do that simply because of the fact that, unlike top birders, they're not spending multiple days a week and every weekend in the field. And where subspecies look different, treat them separately. They don't have to all be in one place. And the crucial thing is that birding is a visual pastime. So everything has to be as visual as possible. Point to the features you mean. And with all of this, we came up with a 3-tick rule. So within a visual group, and you'll see in a second what a visual group is, all the pointers have to be unique within that group. So there's no chance that you can make a false identification. And you simply, once you've been through your families and your visual groups and you know where you're at, you simply match all 3 orange pointers. And effectively, those pointers may not only be visual features, it could be call, it could be habitat, it could be behavior, but there'll always be 3 features that would make a conclusive identification. So let's take, for example, the scrub robins, and particularly down in the Western Cape, you'll have some of these occurring down in your area. And effectively, you've been through your book, you've decided you're dealing with a scrub robin, and fortunately with the scrub robins, there aren't multiple visual groups, but you end up with this little table. And if you look at it closely, if you look at pointer 2, for example, there's 2 scrub robins with a rich rufous rump, and the rest have a brown or a grey-brown rump. So already just looking at the rump alone, you've already ruled out half your birds. And effectively then, if you look with the remaining features, we separate Karoo scrub robin really on the striking wing versus the plain brown wing. And when you're dealing with a bird with a rich rufous rump, you can really look at the lack of a double white bar, and white-browed scrub robin has a double white wing bar. And you'll notice white-browed scrub robin at one point is in red. There are cases where within a group something is so distinctive that nothing else in the group can have it. And then you just simply, if you see that red feature on a bird, that's all you need to make a successful identification. So even looking at that table, which is not a friendly way to present information, you may still think that LBJs are rather daunting. And as we say, don't panic. So really, I'll show you now that there's a 3-step process to identifying LBJs. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you can actually apply this to any birding. If you're dealing with seabirds, if you're dealing with waders, if you're dealing with raptors, the first key thing is to know your families. So decide what family of bird you're dealing with. Find 1 or 2 visual features that you can split the group in half or into a smaller group, and just break it down step by step, ruling out more and more species as you go. And ultimately, this makes it easier. So the first thing that is always important with LBJs is to know your families. And it's every LBJ course, every LBJ book tells you you need to know what a lark versus a pipit is. You need to know when you're looking at a cisticola, when you're looking at a warbler. So what we did was we broke this into separating the families. And all you do is you look at these features and you decide based on the features that are listed there, what family of LBJ you're dealing with. And one of the big things that is constantly mentioned in birding is GIS, or general impression of size and shape. And for that reason, for this part of the book, we used silhouettes. We felt rather than using an illustration might indicate that all the birds in the family look similarly marked, and it might cause confusion. The silhouette is the best way to give you an idea of size and shape without confusing you with additional coloring, which at this point isn't really important. But the key thing here with each of these families is a nice, simple bullet point list. And for those of you that prefer bullet point lists for ID, you look at the at-a-glance block, and it tells you everything you need to know to decide that a warbler is a warbler or a cisticola is a cisticola. And we always continually throughout the book reiterate some of the similar looking species or families throughout and add additional notes to help you make a correct identification, or in this case, correctly decide what family you're dealing with. So at this point, you've now correctly identified your family, and you'll notice that whenever we mention visual features, we point at it. We don't just put a piece of text, we point at exactly what you're looking at. So that if you're new to birding and you don't know what a mantle is or etc., you don't have to know those terminologies of bird physiology. You just look at where the pointer says you have to look. And then, as I mentioned, for those that are list driven and prefer lists of features to look for, there's an at a glance block of what makes a cisticola, etc. And obviously, as you get more confident, you can also use the book to just double check yourself. And someone posted this picture on Facebook and mentioned that they'd taken a picture of a flycatcher. Having done the LBJ's book in quite a lot of detail twice now for 2 editions, something caught my eye, and that was the feet. And they're 2 toes pointing backwards, which means that it can't be a flycatcher because it doesn't have zygodactyl feet. And I quietly messaged the birder concerned saying, just check the feet. And obviously this is a brown-backed honeybird and not a flycatcher. So even if you're fairly comfortable with your ID or think you are, you can always use the book just to double check yourself now and then on families. So once you've decided you're dealing with a warbler or whatever the case may be, the book will tell you to go to a specific page in the book. And now there's a lovely little write-up that tells you a little bit more about, in this case, warblers and allied species. Now, the thing with birding is you're not an LBJ expert, and with every family, the things you need to look for larks may be very different to what you need to look for flycatchers or honey guards and honeybirds. So rather than flip through the book, look at the pointers, and then go and try and look at the bird again to see if the feature's there or not, and by then the bird hasn't stuck around and flown off, so you can't make an identification, we've told you in a simple box at the beginning of that family what to look for. So let's say you've got a little notebook, or you're good with just making mental notes. You don't have to worry about the groups at this stage. That tells you quickly for the warblers what information you need to gather. So you can gather that information on that list about the bird you're dealing with. And if you've got that and the bird's flown off, you should still be able to successfully make an identification even after it's gone. So it really makes it simple to guide you to the right things to look for and not try and photographically memorize the entire bird. Because in many LBJ families, that's not important and not beneficial because they tend to look pretty similar anyway. So on that same page, you'll see that the birds are broken into visual groups. And again, you'll simply go with the pointers and go for warblers, broad heavy tail with no white outer tail feathers, thin tail with no white outer tail feathers and a large size, thin tail, no white outer tail feathers and a small size, and thin tail, white outer tail feathers. So you look at your bird and you quickly decide which of these groups it fits into. And again, we keep these fairly simple. There aren't 10, 15, 20 things to put a bird in a group. We always try and keep it to 2 to 3 features at most. So you've now decided that you're dealing with broad, heavy tail, no white outer tail feathers. And it will tell you in this case, go to page 24. At this point, every other LBJ in the entire book is ruled out because you know you're dealing with a warbler. And 3/4 or more of the warblers are ruled out because you've now narrowed it down based on those features to these 2 birds and nothing else. Some of the groups may be bigger, 5, 6, 8 birds in a group. But just by following those 2 steps of deciding what family it is and putting it in a visual group, you've already ruled out probably 90% of all LBJs. Now you simply look at the plate. And the other thing we did was we didn't do a typical field guide layout where you've got the illustrations on the one side and the text on the other, because I often found myself looking at the picture and then I'd go back and I read the text and then the text doesn't match and then I realize I was looking at the wrong picture. So this back and forth can sometimes be A, confusing, and B, slow you down. So we've intertwined all the information around each species to make sure it's clear and obvious what information belongs to what species. So let's look closely at the individual pages and how it's laid out. So as I mentioned, the text is intertwined and no moving backwards and forwards, and you don't get confused or lost as you go from illustration to text. Wherever there is a visual feature, we will point at it, and the box is colored orange to tell you it's one of the key orange pointers, or the box will be colored red if it's a single feature that makes that bird easy to identify. And you simply read what's in the boxes, and you simply decide, does it match your bird or not? In some cases where we've had to use other things like habitat or call or whatever, we've colored the text in the book to indicate, yet again, in this case, habitat's important. Length isn't, habits aren't. You can go through the book and you can pretty much ignore every bit of black text. You can read that later, but just the stuff that's highlighted in orange or red is what you need to quickly make an identification in the field. And you'll also see that we go into the call and we mention comparative tracks. And this book, like Sassel Birds of Southern Africa, uses the Strake Nature app. So you just scan the barcode and it will play the call and in some cases give you a comparative track. And then again, the key thing I would always want, if I'm looking at a bird and I don't have much time, just tell me in a summary box at a glance what I need to look for. So there are my 3 pointers for this particular warbler, and we'll mention similar looking and similar sounding for those that bird by ear. And right throughout the book over the decades, we've gathered all these little nuances of on the old SA BirdNet and on Facebook and all over the place where people have had interesting discussions to say, well, I separate this LBJ from that one by this feature. We've gathered all those bits of gems of information, checked whether they stack up against looking at skins in museums to see if it holds water and is valid for identification, and then brought all those little gems of information into the notes with each species. But the key thing I mentioned, particularly if you're wanting to learn to bird by ear, and it's quite important with LBJs, is the comparative tracks that are littered throughout the book. And certainly throughout all the books I've done that involve call, I've put a lot of effort and work into saying what sounds similar, how similar sounding birds differ, because there are not too many books that go into that sort of detail. And throughout the book, we've got these comparative tracks that have a narration that explain what you're listening for and have the calls in between. And particularly because the LBJs are very fast moving calls in many cases, we often play the call at half speed and then at full speed so you can hear the differences that you're listening for. So I'll let this comparative track play and you can get an idea of how they benefit you in terms of LBJ identification.
Separating wing snapping, cloud and desert cisticulars and Nedeke on call involves listening to pitch, note inflections and tone. Wing snapping cisticular has a distinctive I'm airs, airs, airs call, with the important characteristic being the inflection on the airs note. Listen first to a single phrase at half speed. Then at full speed. And finally to the full call, which includes wing snaps or clicks. Desert Cisticular's call comprises a repeated series of high-pitched notes on the same frequency. Note that they sound identical to the high-pitched repetitive notes of Nediki. Listen first at half speed. And now at full speed. Desert Cisticular also gives a series of clicking notes. Although not wing clicks, these sound very similar to the clicks made by wing snapping cisticular and should not be used as a feature on their own for identification. Here is a full recording of Desert Cisticular's call, including the clicking sounds. Now listen to a comparative clip of wing snapping cisticular. Cloud cisticular's call has a three-pitched phrase. The low-pitched introductory note is followed by 3 or 4 mid-pitched notes and then by 2 or 3 high-pitched notes. The call concludes with several rapid chirps. Although the mid-pitched notes may seem to be reminiscent of wing snapping cisticular, they lack the air's inflection. Here is cloud cisticular's call, first at half speed, and now at full speed. Nediki has a repetitive, high-pitched call that is almost identical to that of Desert Cisticular, and care should be taken when separating the two species on this call alone. However, Nediki also has a more common call that comprises repeated staccato chirps, similar to the clicks of Desert Cisticular, but the call is much fuller and persists for longer.
So that will give you some idea of how we've structured these comparative tracks. And I think there's in the region of about 40 of them throughout the book, covering a range of similar sounding LBJs. So in all of this, I mentioned earlier that subspecies are handled differently to the way field guides handle it. And I'll get to this in a moment. So let's look at rattling cisticular, for example. It has a staggering 17 subspecies in our region, and some of them look different. So those of you that know rattling cisticular reasonably well know it to be a bird with a fairly well-marked back. But you'll notice here that we've said rattling cisticulars in the plain back group. And specifically, there's a race in Mozambique, the Procerus race, which has a plain back. You'll also notice if you look closely at the map, that's not the map for rattling cisticular. That's the map only for this race. So where we've said a specific race, rather than confuse you that you could see it anywhere in the country, we've indicated very clearly with the map, the only place you're likely to get a plain-backed rattling cisticular is up in Mozambique. Now you look further on, we've got long-tailed bold markings on brown back. And that's the rattling cisticular that most people know, and you'll see that it covers a good portion of the country. But you'll notice it's missing that piece of Mozambique because it doesn't occur there, well, this particular race. And there's yet another variation of rattling cisticular that has a grey back with markings. And again, you'll see this one is up in Namibia and Botswana. And if you go back to the other one, you'll see the map for the brown back variation doesn't include that Namibia-Botswana area. So we've not only separated the subspecies visually, but we've also separated them on distribution to avoid further confusion. So effectively, rattling cisticola is handled in 3 separate visual groups on 3 separate pages. And when you're in a given area or a given visual group, you only need to consider what's in that region. So the next question is, surely there must be more to LBJ identification than just that. And of course there always is. It's not that simple that you can just deal it that easily. So effectively, for those that have the first edition, the question with any bird book is why upgrade, particularly if you've got first edition. What are the differences? And obviously for those that haven't seen first edition, there's some interesting additional pieces of information we brought in to help improve it over the first work. So originally, because we said made simple, we felt that the reed warblers, which ideally you actually need the bird in the hand with wing formula, for most birders are inseparable in the field. We felt for a purist, it would be nice having something to separate the reed warblers, so we included the wing formulae. And there are cases where maybe you're lucky enough with a reed warbler to get a picture of it in flight with a good digital camera, and you may well be able to do the wing formula from that photo, in which case this will help you in making an identification. As well, the aerial displaying cisticolas, cloud, desert, wing snapping, pale crowned, zitting. Not only do they have unique calls, but they have unique display flight paths. So we've illustrated what those flight paths look like, because to go with the call, the patterns that they fly and how high they are off the ground or not is unique to the various species. In some of the cisticola species, where primarily distribution and habitat is crucial, we've added handy little quick reference lookup guides. So habitat and distribution quick reference. With that particular group, just with this table alone, you should be able to make a quick identification just using that simple little box. And then for the trickier groups, so the famous tricky group of Eastern clapper, Cape clapper, flappet, and rufous naped, they all look fairly similar and trip up a lot of birders. We've given a nice double page spread to specifically dealing with how you would separate these 4 species. And we've updated our habitat photos and tried to make sure generously throughout the whole book, we have habitat for everything, because ultimately when we say habitat is important, it's useful to have a photo of what we mean by a particular habitat. In addition, we're the only LBJ guide currently that has all of the new species for the region. So we've added Upsher's warbler, rufous-tailed scrub robin, which you guys in Cape Town are famous for, having the only record of rufous-tailed scrub robin. Sadly, I was down in Cape Town on business while it was there, and I never even had time to get out of the office to see it, so I missed that one. Then we also felt there were 2 weavers left out. Although these aren't really LBJs, we felt it just made sense to add the 2 remaining weavers in, so we covered all of the weavers. And then species that are no longer considered species, the thorny topic of Kimberley and long-tailed pipits, seen as they're no longer considered species, we removed them from the book, and we restructured our pipit model to make sure that if you came across what people did consider Kimberley or long-tailed, you'll still make a correct identification based on where they lumped in now. And overall, we've taken all little bits of feedback that we've got from people over the years as to where they felt the book worked well, areas that they didn't, and used that to improve second edition. And also this much greater treatment of subspecies. There were a lot more subspecies splits in the second edition versus the first, because a lot of the geographical information wasn't available when we did first edition. And as I mentioned, the subspecies specific maps. In first edition, we didn't do that. We always kept the distribution for the whole species and not that particular subspecies that looked different. As well, the original book was missing probably, I think, about 35 bird calls that we didn't have. Other than Stark's lark, every single species now has at least one call. And in many cases, we've got other calls since, alarm calls and so on. So we've not only increased the call library with the book, but we've also re-recorded and remastered a lot of these calls to make sure that the quality of the calls is top-notch, and specifically using our newly launched and remastered Nature Sounds call library. So in terms of what would make it a must-have, as I mentioned, it's the only fully updated LBJ guide in the region. It's the only LBJ guide that has accompanying bird calls. And it's the only book in the region, other than some of my other works, that list similar sounding. There are no other field guides or ID guides that I'm aware of that have similar sounding in the text. And we're the only book in the region, and possibly even in the world that I'm aware of, that has these comparative tracks to help you learn to bird by ear. And interestingly enough, even when we tested first edition, we took a complete novice out and we said, okay, the only help we will give you, considering you've never looked at a bird in your life before, we can't expect you to separate larks and pipits if you've never touched a pair of binoculars. So we'll tell you you're dealing with a pipit. That's all we're going to tell you. There's the book. And we started a stopwatch, and confidently and correctly, he got his identification of his pipit correct in under 2 minutes. And he'd literally never birded in his life before. So that's a claim, I think, for any LBJ work is quite unique. And honestly, it's not only us that say hopefully it'll change your life. I had a lady at Mari Vale come up to me and proudly smiling, holding up her LBJ book, and she said, "Thanks for changing my life." So honestly, it really does, in our opinion, make LBJs as easy as possible. And I've seen many beginners just confidently launch in and get their LBJ identification correct. So yeah, that's basically an overview of the new book. And for those that have never seen the Made Simple books before, how they work, I don't know if anyone has any questions.
I think if people would like to post questions, they can put them in the chat box. If you would like to ask a question, I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves. So you can ask a question live if you would rather do that. I've just got to work out how to do that. Participants. There is some way to do it. You can unmute all. There you go. I'll ask you all to unmute yourselves, and you can unmute if you would like to ask a question. Is there anyone who has a question? I would like to ask a question. How long did it take you, Doug, to produce the second edition? Are you able to quantify it?
Yeah, the second edition was about just under a year, primarily because we reworked a lot of the modeling, and we had to fit all these various subspecies into these groups and make sure we didn't get false matches. And so it certainly wasn't a couple of new illustrations, change a few names and add some calls. It was quite an extensive rework. So yeah, it was about a year of work to make sure that we improved it and made it a significant improvement on first edition.
I'm actually surprised you say that it was under a year. I would have thought it would take you much, much longer to just plan everything and get it together, as well as your full-time job. I would understand if you were working only on this book, but I'm quite sure it's...
Yeah, fortunately,
more.
my co-author Gordon and I have been working on a number of made simple works, not only here. Now that he's in Australia, we've been doing a lot of stuff for Australian birds, although none of that's published at this stage. So we certainly have fine-tuned into quite a process, efficient process, modeling species and families and visual groups. So we've gotten to the point where we're quite efficient at it, but yeah, it was a complete rework.
Yes. I do have a question from Dennis Laidler, who's actually sitting with 3 other people. So there are 4 of them. And he says, please explain more about the barcodes, how to read them and play the calls.
Yeah, so effectively,
Cecil don't know.
Yeah, so you don't have to have the Cecil eBirds app or the Cecil book at all.
Mm-hmm.
If you just look on Google Play Store, the App Store on our phone, whatever, there's a Strake Nature app. It's free, and it works with anything Strake Nature going forward is putting these barcodes in. So you download the app, the app's free, you can't do anything with it without a book. And then literally in the app, you just say scan, and it uses your camera and you point it at the page, and the app reads the barcode, and then it knows which call to play.
And of course, that means that the print quality of your book has to be fantastic. You can't have fuzzy barcodes because...
Yeah, no, exactly. And
yes.
Strake have always, I mean, everyone knows that their books are, well, Penguin Random House now, Strake Nature, their quality is very high. Interestingly enough, there was a mix-up with the printers with this book, and if you get this current print run, the cover is a very silky, high-quality paper, and the whole book, which apparently is double the price, but it was done by mistake by the printers overseas, and Strake said, well, that's your fault, not ours. So when they do a reprint, it'll go back to the normal sort of paper like a Cecil Birds or any of the books normally have. But if you happen to get from this first print run, it's got this most awesome quality, soft, matte, velvety sort of paper. It's really incredible paper. But I can guarantee you the next one won't be printed on the same paper.
Are there any more questions or comments that people would like to make?
Yeah, I just saw Sean said, thanks, you made LBJs look easy. Looking forward to getting the book. Yeah, well, I hope it works for you and good luck. And there is an LBJs Made Simple Facebook group. So if you want to interact with others or get my advice on using the book or something you've seen, by all means, you're welcome to join that Facebook group, and I'll happily assist anyone who's on that group.
I think that's it. So it then comes to me, and I'm unmuting myself. Oh, what's happened? I've lost you all. Can you see me still?
Yeah.
You can see me. I've lost everything. I'm looking at a very strange... there we come. I've so enjoyed your talk. And one thing I know for sure is that I'm going to be going and buying this second edition, even though I do have a first edition. I think you've convinced me. So, Anne, I think you are there. Please save one for me. And I just love the fact that you've made it so easy by tabulating, because that's one of my problems, is when something comes in a paragraph, as it does in the most of the field guides, I have great difficulty separating features out. And I also love the way you've used color to highlight what's really important, the salient points. And thank you very, very much. I'm quite sure that many members in the Bird Club, we have relatively few watching tonight because we've got major load shedding in the Claremont area. So, and that's actually where many of our members live, is in Claremont, Rondebosch. But they will be able to listen to this recording if you give me permission to put the recording onto our website, not onto our YouTube. Are you happy for us to do that?
By all means, that'll be awesome.
They will watch that, and then hopefully we will have lots and lots of sale through Anne Gregg of book sales, and also at the quiz evening where she's going to be running her bookstore. So thank you very, very much, Doug. And
awesome, and thanks for having me.
Would everyone like to put on their videos, and let's see you all. Everybody put on your videos. Let's have a matrix of Cape Bird Club members. There you go. Pictures get smaller and smaller. So now you can see some of the people who have been listening to you. But this is very few because we've still got more than 20 people online.
Yeah.
We went up to 35 at one stage. So, oh, I can see Dave Whitelaw sitting in the dark. And Dennis Laidler sitting in the dark. Yes. Okay, thank you again, Doug. And,
yes, thank you.
Yes, are you going on Flock?
No, I'm not.
Not.
No, just too many work commitments at the moment. But nice to actually be busy and in demand in these rather turbulent times. But yeah,
I'm sure.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Cheers.
Give your waves. Come along. Whoops. It's hard to get that going. All right. I'm ending the meeting now. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.